Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to, or welcome back to, another episode of Haunted Gaming R. On this episode, I'll be reading in a word for word style a Donkey Kong creepypasta called simply Donkey Kong Country. So, suspend your disbelief, grab your coconut gun, and let's vine swing on into Donkey Kong Country. When I was 13 years old, I had put my SNES into a box in the attic along with many other fashionable items from the era. I had moved on to the Nintendo 64. It wasn't until a few years later I had come across a copy of Donkey Kong Country at a swap meet. For only $2 nonetheless, but with a torn up cover. I instantly remembered wanting to play through this game, as I had rented the sequels a few years back and I was curious about the original. I thought it would be an interesting flashback and a good excuse to dust off the old SNES. I'd forgotten about the cart, however, as I was going out of town the following summer, so it sat on my shelf collecting dust for months. Months turned to years, and the cart was completely forgotten about. It wasn't until 2011 that I had opened up an old box containing the following: my broken PS2, my PS1 without cables, and a set of boxes containing various things that I had pawned or stolen throughout my youth. Among them was that Donkey Kong Country cart, now over 20 years old. I decided that it was maybe time I dusted off the old SNES and gave the game a go finally. I put the cart in, hoping to play Donkey Kong Country, as the idea of it had rested in the back of my subconscious for the better part of a decade. The cover was severely damaged, and one thing I noticed after looking at the cart online for reference was that the ones that were released in stores were gray. This one, however, was yellow, so I could only assume it was a prototype or limited edition run of some sort. I did know that Donkey Kong 64 carts were yellow, but this was an entirely different game from an entirely different time. The front of the cover sticker was completely ripped at the bottom, and the cartridge overall had that torn paper look that they get over time. Someone had scrawled the words, "Internal use only," at the back of the cartridge with presumably a Sharpie. Seeing the yellow coloration of the cartridge and the Sharpie writing of internal use only on the back made me more excited and intrigued, knowing I likely had a prototype game on my hands. Ready to play it, I put it into the SNES and flipped the on switch on. The game started as I thought it would, but there was no Rare logo at the beginning, nor was there any mention of Nintendo for the title screen either. Which I guess makes sense in the context of it being a prototype or unfinalized game that wouldn't have any of the associated branding or even full approval from Nintendo yet. The beginning animation started with Cranky Kong turning the vinyl record as per usual from the gameplay I've seen of it on YouTube, atop some metal beams. As I was playing on a flat screen with a default SNES cable hookup, the picture seemed a little bit grainier, however. The music was completely different. It sounded muffled or drowned out, even though it was the same song as it was in the normal game. Based off the videos I've seen, Donkey Kong would drop down and hit Cranky Kong while he enjoyed his record. Instead of a boombox, however, what looked like a hand melded with a red anvil fell on top of the player. Donkey Kong dropped down for the dance animation, but his graphic was off center by a few pixels in each direction, and his hand was also elongated to a few inches longer than usual, making it look distorted and a bit off-putting. When Cranky throws the TNT barrel, the cart froze. I had to reset a few times and press start to even get the game to play properly, as it kept freezing repeatedly upon that happening. I had to quickly run Donkey Kong off the main map into the jungle hijinks level before the game froze again. Donkey Kong's graphic looked looked visually sadder in his facial expression. I went into a room which read Donkey Kong's Banana Horde, and the game locked up for about 3 seconds before putting me on a weird island that wasn't in any of the gameplay footage I saw online. There were fully rendered pirate skeletons, and Donkey Kong couldn't interact at all. I eventually had to commit suicide by jumping into the ocean, outlying the island before returning to the entrance of Jungle Hijinks. I had started to play through the game, but I noticed each time I made Donkey Kong jump on a barrel, the picture got grainier and more dark-tinged. It seemed as though a programming bug was making the screen more sepia-tinted, and the music was off. Most of the time it was flipping between sound channels, and other times it wouldn't play at all. After the Jungle Hijinks level was completed, I couldn't move on to the next stage, however. Sawtooth's Mines? Normally, you would be able to just move on to it according to most of the guides and videos I've seen online, but instead I had to move Donkey Kong upwards to an unmarked area of the world map. It had a weird X marked by 2 trees, but it was barely visible. It was a swimming stage with no music, and all the coral was red. The area looked more or less like a river of blood, and I swam Donkey Kong downward with no collectible bananas or any enemies in sight. It wasn't until about 3 minutes of swimming downward that I noticed something that looked like a human eye emerging from the depths of the rocks that were painted into the backdrop. It was getting more visible the lower I swam. I also had to double tap the buttons because the swimming had a delay. I noticed an error meter after about 3 minutes. Finally, the screen froze and some text appeared. If you wish to enter Sawtooth Mines, first you have to pay the fine. A drowning animation of Donkey Kong was shown that was very disturbing. He clutched at his neck and pulled his tie off, in a final display as the life was completely sucked out of him. The screen went black and glitched out. I had restarted with a white Donkey Kong sprite on a stage named In Limbo. It was just a typical rope swing section that seemed to be copy-pasted from another stage, with a lot of glitches and missing parts of the floor that looked like pits but could actually be walked over. The various Razor Bee enemies also couldn't damage me. I think it was impossible to die. I know this was 100% not in the original game, but what concerned me more was that there was a trap door near the exit. I felt compelled to finish the stage for some reason, but even more compelled to break through the trap door to see what was possibly behind it. I remember from the other Donkey Kong Country games that if you reach a high enough height, you can break through trapdoors. So I went all the way to the beginning of the stage and found ledges that allowed me to climb up to and weave around the top of the map until I reached the end, occasionally having to jump higher than the screen would allow. This whole process took over an hour, and I wasn't sure my NES even had enough processing power to handle the whole thing, seeing as how there was visual lag and stuttering starting to happen the closer I got to the end of the stage. I finally jumped off the top of the stage and went crashing through the trap door, the stage transitioning via a black screen. The inside of the following stage was a long hallway with only one Chinese text character on the floor. At the end of it was a snake sprite that might have been a prototype for the spring snake or some other similar concept that never ended up being in the game. The song DK Island Swing abruptly started. There was some very weird text that displayed, and it goes as the following. My name is Adam. I'm 13. They've abducted me and they're holding me and my family captive. If you can read this, I'm about to be drowned to death. Please send help before it's too late. After reading that text, my spine began to tingle. Shortly, a 16-bit image of a chimpanzee flashed on the screen for a quarter of a second. It was then that I realized that Diddy Kong was not a playable character in this version of the game. There was an abrupt, bit-crushed sound of a monkey squealing, and it sounded like it was in very intense pain. The game finally launched Donkey Kong through a set of barrels and out of the stage. I decided to try and finish the game as I was put back onto the world map, returning to and finally entering Sawtooth Mines. It was a minecart stage, but the track never moved. I heard what sounded like a grainy, tiny voice begin to whisper. It was ineligible, as it was very bit-crushed and distorted. I jumped on the tracks over and over again, trying to figure out if there was a trick to it. The whispering had begun to sound like thunder. It hissed, but it was very illegible still. I kept jumping on the track, thinking maybe the jumping was triggered by some timing of the voice, or vice versa. I tried endlessly to finish the level, but I assumed it couldn't be finished. I left the game on for a full 40 hours. I knew if I reset, I'd either have to start all over or the game might break completely. It was already extremely glitched and broken. I left that little red SNES light on as I went to sleep. It was hard to sleep with the game running because Donkey Kong's animation and the speeding cart started to look a little visually sad after a while. The hissing was disturbing, but it seemed to be changing, leveling, or equalizing. As I slept on my bunk bed, I heard the voice whisper, "Son." Finally. Words. Son. Son. It sounded like an animal trying to form human words. I immediately picked up the controller and tried to make Donkey Kong jump, but there was no feedback from the player anymore at all. The 16-bit voice kept pleading, "Son," as the eye emerged from the blackness again. It zoomed out more and more until I saw it was a grainy-looking face of a disheveled ape, with blood also on its face. It proceeded to say, "What have they done to my son?" The voice hissed and crackled from the dated technology. And then I paused the game. It had turned into a slideshow somehow. A weird slideshow of 16-bit images showing what appeared to be the inside of a laboratory or testing facility of some kind. The visuals were very hard to see due to the 16-bit images being very compressed, but they were pictures of apes inside of cages in the laboratory. Further images being those same apes being drowned in some type of cage experiment. Others after that being other apes being tortured while people took notes. The faces of the people in all the images were completely blacked out, but they looked to all be dressed in science or otherwise doctor-related clothes. One image was a shot of one holding a dismembered ape head. One of the last images was all of the people all gathered in a very familiar pose, one that I recognized. The next image is what appeared to be a destroyed human torso being eaten by a completely shaven ape, which also had bloody fangs. The entrails of the torso were leading out into another room, and the torso had been dehumanized, absolutely gnawed on by the ape to being almost just a piece of meat. The next shot was a face and the date tag of the prison convict who I assumed donated his body to science or was used for the experiment. I tried to go back and compare the two images of the eaten person and the convict to see if the body type was similar, but I couldn't go back in the slideshow as none of the buttons were responding, period. The last shot was just the title screen of the final game, but without Diddy Kong present, with the words, "You'll Go Bananas, 1989," in the normal game's text font. I pressed start and was returned to the end of the stage. With nowhere left to go, after exiting the level, I decided to check around the map more. I couldn't re-access Sawtooth Mines for some reason, and Jungle Hijinks was the only possible other option, so I decided to go back to the Banana Horde room and back up onto the abandoned island. The pirate skeletons looked more familiar. In fact, they were doing the same poses that the people in the specific group photo slideshow image were doing. After a few minutes of just pressing different buttons and messing around, I found out that if you pressed down and held the A button for 3 seconds, names would appear above all the skeletons. All of them were rare employees that worked on the game. One was a larger and more ape-like skeleton that was the anomaly of the bunch. Its name was simply Adam. This time, when I jumped into the ocean to make Donkey Kong commit suicide, the game truly froze with no resets or returning to the map. I did restart the console and test it again, and it still miraculously worked somehow. After turning it off, I tried to find some information about the card online, but obviously it was to no avail. I didn't want to upload any footage of the game because of the gore and disturbing imagery that was obviously going to get me flagged or banned on YouTube. So I put the card up on eBay before being hit with a $600,000 lawsuit from the Rare Company, which was now a subsidiary of Microsoft, I believe. I got sent a very threatening message over the eBay messaging system soon after my listing for the game got taken down. They told me that my life as a professional contractor and plumber was basically over if I ever tried to actually release or go through with releasing that card to the general public. As an explanation for the game itself, they insisted that it was merely a prank regarding some of the Rare employees having fun and making something sadistic on purpose. But I knew with all of that blood, all of the images of gore and dead apes, that it was no prank, and that Rare had done something horrible to get the final game on store shelves. I had told them in a message response that I had destroyed the cart, which ceased the harassing phone calls and letters that were affectionately addressed to Super Fuckface Mario, as evidently my plumbing profession had ruffled the feathers of some of the higher-ups of Rare and the people running the harassment campaign. I still have the cart, though, however. It's in a box with the rest of my old college stuff, and it'll sit there for days. Days will become weeks, months, and then years. The cart will still be there. If they ever want it back, they'll have to pry it from my cold, dead hands. Well, that, ladies and gentlemen, was Donkey Kong Country, a Donkey Kong creepypasta about a prototype game with a not so hidden message about horrible ape experimentation that might have been happening. Well, tell me what you thought about the story in the comments and what you would like to see next if you were so inclined. And while the video would normally end here, I do have an extra little blooper clip to put at the end, as by sheer fucking weird coincidence, while I was recording previous parts of the video, an object at the other end of my room just sort of fell to the ground by itself, and I thought it was, weird and creepy enough of a occurrence to be worthy of putting into, a video about creepy stuff. So I guess enjoy that. I left that little red NES slide on as I went to sleep, It was hard to sleep with the game running because Donkey Kong's animation and the speeding cart started to look. What the fuck?